I'm Nikki Wheeler-Nicholson, and my grandfather, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, started National Allied Publications in 1934, and in 1935, in January, he published New Fun #1, and that was the beginning of what we consider modern comics and the beginning of DC Comics. So today we're mostly going to talk about women. Yay. And this is my book. It just came out, DC Comics Before Superman. I'm at the Hermes booth. Okay. In researching my grandfather's early comics, one of the things that struck me, because I'm obviously influenced by Trina, is the women heroines. So that's why I really wanted to focus on that today. So we're going to talk about some of the early female heroines that it might surprise you were here at the very beginning, pre-Wonder Woman. So this is my grandmother's very first comic, New Fun #1, which came out in January 1935. It was tabloid size. And this is an early photo of my grandfather, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, when he was in 1912 on the Texas border at Fort Bliss.
Nikki, was that the Rough Riders?
No, but he was very much influenced by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a friend of the family's, and so that's why he was interested in, one of the reasons he was interested in following an Army career. And when he got out of the Army in 1921, he started writing pulp adventure stories. And this is one of the pulp adventure stories. Do you guys know what pulps are? Okay. So the stories that he wrote were in the adventure magazines, and they were geared towards a general audience. And then in 1925, he started his first newspaper syndicate, and one of the things he did in the newspaper syndicate, he already had this idea of comics and publishing comics. So he was doing it in the newspapers in 1925. And one of the things that he did was he did classics like Treasure Island. The Robert Louis Stevenson scholars consider him to be the first person who put Treasure Island in graphic form. So he was already thinking about this back in 1925. This is one of the more salacious pulps, Spicy Detective. Do one of you guys want to say something about that?
The Spicy Detective stories was run by Harry Donenfeld, who ended up later acquiring DC Comics. And Adolphe Barreau was an advertising illustrator who also drew comics in New Fun 1, but before that did do Sally the Sleuth, a comic strip that had a female star. And it's interesting in that she could solve mysteries that other men couldn't, but there are still some obvious sexist elements, like being saved by a male hero at the end of a story, or being scantily clad. So it'd be almost like the 30s version of like a 70s exploitation movie. But it was a step toward a female star in a comic strip.
Brad, you want to answer?
Yeah, comics kind of was made sense for that, because you could do a lot of, like Mickey said, salacious stuff in text, but when you could show it with an illustration, that was just another way to sell it to the boys who were buying it.
And if you guys ever get a chance to check out Adolphe Barreau, he's a really fascinating character. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to really get into all that, but he's definitely worth looking up. This is another Sally the Sleuth.
Right, and that's, again, an example of, like, that last thing at the end is her explaining to a more clueless detective of how she solved the mystery. So there are these elements of where she was smarter than the guy in the strip, and it is pretty interesting for a readership geared toward men at the time. So it is an interesting point.
And she's in her broad face too.
Right.
There was always some excuse for her to lose her clothes.
Okay, this is a 1940s pulp G-Men detectives, and what happened with my grandfather's comics when he first started National Allied and brought out the first magazine. He used those pulp adventure stories as the format for the comics. So he brought pulps into the office and told the writers and artists, here's what we're going to use as an example. And the pulps themselves, if you know pulps or read pulps, they're really great for becoming comics because there's a very organized way of telling the story that makes sense and it's easy to follow, and they just naturally lend themselves to a graphic representation. This is, gosh, remind me, what year is this? This is January 1936, right? Anyway, it's right there. I'm sorry, my mind is gone. That trek was blank. This was the first, what we consider to be a comic-sized comic. And I've got it right here, December 1935. Okay. So that was the first comic book that went from the tabloid size to a regular comic book size. And some of the guys that I know say that had a lot to do with paper, so that it was more productive. My grandfather started Detective Comics in 1937, and I just love this cover. That's why I'm showing it. It's December 1937, and if you guys are familiar with Craig Fliesel, he's one of the really important artists of that period. And what I think is so innovative about him is that he took that pulp cover idea and really made it into a graphic form. So I think he was one of the innovators of this early period. And this is the cover of Action Comics, and the artist is Leo O'Malia, which probably, I don't know if many of you know about him, but he's another amazing figure from that period that had a lot of innovations during that period. This is one of my favorite covers of all time because I think it tells the story so clearly. You know exactly what's going on there, or at least enough to intrigue you. Here's some of his artwork in the early comics, and look at the innovative styles here. No longer in a strip. So the comics are now changing to, the format itself is changing to move the story.
And something I want to say is in Nikki's book, there's really nice pages of Leo Amelia art, and it is pretty amazing the illustrative approach he takes to those comics. It really is riveting stuff.
This is from that early period. It's a story of my grandfather's. It came from the pulps, and the artist here is Munson Paddock, and this is called the Monastery of the Blue God. And look at how different the style is. So my grandfather was really interested in artists who could portray different styles by their artwork.
This is where I can comment. Munson Paddock was Cecilia Paddock Munson. And she signed, I guess the earliest stuff she signed with a male name, Munson Paddock, but later it was Cecilia Paddock Munson. And it's really weird because I have had guys insisting that that was just a pseudonym, Cecilia Paddock Munson, and it was really by a man, because they can't believe that women were drawing comics that early. But the fact is, why in the world would a man use a woman's pseudonym for an action comic? So of course it's Cecilia Paddock Munson.
I put that in there for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we get into Saundra of the Secret Service. And I was fascinated by this character, and I didn't realize, the research I've done, it appears that my grandfather created this character. The artist who drew the character were not, they didn't create any other characters. And there were several different artists. And Jerry Bales, one of the great comics historians, attributed a lot of the scripts to my grandfather. And one of the reasons that I think he created this character is that my great grandmother, Antoinette Wheeler-Nicholson, was a suffragette. She advocated the right for women to vote. So my grandfather grew up in a household with very strong women who were advocating women's rights. And all of his female characters are very, very strong. They usually can do all kinds of athletic feats. They can shoot guns. They can ride horses. They're not afraid to get into conflict. And so, you know, it appears to me that he did create this character. Do you want to talk some, Alex, about it?
Yeah, so it's interesting to see the evolution of the female character in comics. So we have the Sally the Sleuth character, but Saundra takes it to a stronger level where there is no exploitative elements, none of those sexist elements. There's still that element of solving mysteries that the other male co-stars couldn't, but she was also more of kind of like a James Bond type of character where she was in Eastern Europe, being involved in espionage and always able to physically defend herself. A lot of times, there's a whole story arc toward the end of the Gavonian affair where she's trying to save this male spy, and he's always passing out. She has to drag his body into an airplane and pilot the airplane by herself. So this is a real brave character and full of action, and she's always on top of it. Every panel, she's always on top of everything, always outsmarting everyone. So it is a really interesting comic to be reading from 1935, 36, and 37. The Gavonian affair goes over like a lot of issues, but it's actually really good.
So I was just going to mention that Saundra of the Secret Service, Charles Flanders, started it in New Fund 1, 2, and 3, and then Monroe Eisenberg took over in New Fund 4 and 5, and then Walter Brigham took over, and he did 6 through 20. And then William Eli started with More Fun 21. So there were a number of different artists, but most of the scripts are attributed to my grandfather.
And also during the Brigham era is when I think Sandra's character is really established. I think those are where you really get a sense of her personality.
So this is one from the Brigham period.
And this is a great 3 panels because it starts with her kind of playing to this premiere of there's fake Eastern European countries that are named in this, but she's kind of pretending to be kind of going along with him, but she's actually a spy. Then there's intrigue where another spy interacts with her. And what's funny is when the spy thinks he's got the best of her, she grabs his paperweight and just smashes him in the head with it and knocks him out. And then enjoys a nice glass of red wine right after that, which is just an incredible sequence.
This is why I know my grandfather had something to do with it. Okay, so this is that close-up of that Alex was just talking about. And this is also, I can't tell which one this is. This is also Walter Brigham, right?
Yeah, this takes place after that other story, but she's trying to save that spy. She becomes friends with the spy that she knocks out because they realize it was a misunderstanding. But, you know, all the panels are full of her kind of dodging things and saving him, and she's just basically like a female action hero, which is pretty cool.
Okay, and here's that scene Alex was talking about when she has to take care of Lorenz.
Yes, Lorenz.
And this is William Eli, and I really like his artwork. I think his artwork is the most sophisticated. And of course, at this point, this must have been about 1937 at this point, you can see the evolution of the artwork of the artist from the first early comics, and now they're getting more sophisticated in the way they're illustrating things. And I think this is very beautifully drawn. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a character called Sally Norris that Siegel and Schuster, my grandfather hired Siegel and Schuster in April 1935. And they started working, their first pieces for him came out in October 1935. And I'm gonna let Brad talk about some of these. So this is Slam Bradley. I know, my grandfather created this character. A lot of people don't know that. I have a letter that he wrote to Jerry Siegel in which he says, there's this character, his name is going to be Slam Bradley, and he describes the character to Jerry and describes the kind of action that he wants Jerry to use the character in. Brad, you wanna?
Yeah, and I hope everyone is kind of weighing the historical importance of Nikki's words. When you're sitting in a room and hearing someone say, well, my grandfather started Detective Comics, and my grandfather hired Siegel and Schuster. I mean, this is where it all begins. So Slam Bradley, I mean, if everyone will just look at the, I mean, again, it's an adventure strip. I don't think it's as sophisticated as Saundra. Slam stories were kind of, he would just beat everybody up who was in the panel and kiss a girl at the end. A different one every time. And if you look at that top right-hand panel, you see Slam, he's just beat people up, his shirt's open, and I mean, who do we see? You may not have heard of Slam Bradley. I mean, he is currently in DC continuity somewhat, but who do you see when you see those two figures? Who does he look like? He doesn't look like Superman. He is Superman. I mean, he's talking to Lois Lane. So
all the guys he drew looked like Superman, and all the women he drew looked like Lois Lane. I mean, if you've seen his softcore porn, I've seen a picture of basically Lois Lane whipping Superman.
Oh yeah. And I think they looked on, I mean, we'd have to ask Craig Yo, but I think they look like Superman on purpose for that. But this is where, it doesn't begin with Action Comics 1. This is all being worked through in all of these comics, through all these different artists. I mean, these are the two that made it out and hit the big time, more or less. But you look at Slam, that's Superman and Lois.
I love Joe Shuster's artwork during this period.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Particularly. I think this particular period, I think probably before his eyesight really started to go and before he was so pressured to turn out so much from DC, that I think this period is some of his best artwork, in my opinion. So this is also from Slam Bradley.
Yeah, and this is so, like I said, most every adventure had the kind of love interest who Slam would kiss at the end, and his assistant there, Shorty, would say, oh, Slam, why don't I get all the girls, and something like that. But in this particular adventure, they meet someone named Joan Carter, who goes toe-to-toe with Slam to solve a mystery that takes place on Broadway, of all places. And Joan Carter is if we know our Superman history, was the physical model for Lois Lane. And this is when they had Superman, they're working on Superman, but if you read these old comics, this is where they start to bring in the Lois character. And this is Lois. This is what Lois looks like. This is what Lois does. She punches people from time to time, but they're also using the same physical model. So you can make a great case that Lois Lane doesn't really appear just in Action Comics 1, that who she really is appears in these early comics too. And she's wearing like a Superman suit too.
And I have to say that Shorty is clearly Jerry Siegel all the way.
Oh yeah, completely.
Totally his humor. Okay, so this is you were talking about the kiss at the end.
The same last panel, which is great comics, for their audience in particular. Every last panel is the same.
Okay, so now we get to Bart Reagan Spy. And Sally Norris is the character that, the female character that comes out of this.
And I think something interesting about this is, in the first couple, when they say Bart Regan spy, as the story goes along, and you'll see some examples, but Sally Norris becomes just as formidable in the comic as Bart Regan does, and they become almost like a Mr. and Mrs. Smith, spy couple. And so you see it becomes more almost gender neutral on the titles, where it doesn't highlight just Bart Regan, and it becomes just more called Spy by itself. And it becomes more consistent with Sally Norris having an increasing role in the comic.
And I love this artwork. It's gorgeous. So this is Detective 1, 1937, Sally's first appearance.
And it's funny because he's clearly the male hero in this, but she's kind of like a love interest. She starts off as a love interest that just won't leave him alone, won't take no for an answer. And that's kind of, that dynamic is set up pretty soon, where you think it's going to be all about him, but it becomes more all about her.
So when were the Thin Man movies? This is pretty much during this period, right?
I think a little earlier.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that this is kind of similar to that genre. I love this panel, it's really great. This is from Detective 2.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how feisty Sally Norris is, that when the guy tries to attack her, he's not sure who to rescue.
This is from Detective 5, and I don't have my glasses, so I can't see what it says,
Right.
but there's a reason it's here.
Well, it's here to show that this is now she's becoming a predominant character, and she's solving the crimes, and he's a little more clueless, and she's kind of figuring out what the bad guys are doing.
And she drives the whole strip. In the beginning, like, Bart has to, go work for the Secret Service. There's all these intimations that he dumped Sally, and she just won't take no for an answer. So what does she do? She applies to the Secret Service to be a spy, and they accept her, of course. And she turns out to be better at it than he does. And they eventually, they're back together, they get engaged, they possibly get married, they have a wedding, it doesn't quite go off, but it's this really great, the stuff we see on TV all the time. The partners forced to work together, but there's this simmering tension between them. I mean, they were doing it, and it was being done in the movies too, but this is where they're doing it perfectly in the comics. And it's Clark and Lois.
And just think about this. This is pre-Wonder Woman. And this is this is 1937 this is happening. This is where she's chasing him, right? I can't read it.
Right, that's more of a continuation of the same thing, where again she's aggressively problem solving and being a lot more proactive about taking out the criminals in the story than arguably Bart Regan is. Yeah, and this panel is funny because this is where the party's over for Bart Regan in a way, because I don't know if the head of the U.S. spy headquarters is supposed to look like J. Edgar Hoover or not, but it looks like he breaks it to Bart that, yeah, she's part of the Secret Service now, and you guys are going to be partners, and he's like, well, okay. So this is where you realize that she's completely taken over the book, and then it becomes Spy, and with no gender specific title.
I just think it's interesting that she became the interesting character. Because, when you think about it, you think about her more than you think about him. He's sort of generic in a way.
So is Clark Kent. I mean, who likes Lois way more than Clark? Thinks she's more interesting than Clark. I think she is. But it's kind of that. I mean, she's Sally, she's not Lois, but we can see that that's where it's going. That's where they got it.
Well, we could go off on a whole riff here about the superhero and the human part, but we're not, because I want to make sure we get to Trina talking about Miss Fury. So, okay, this is where she. Okay, Alex.
Yeah, this is basically another example of the same theme, where again they're problem solving, and she's kind of in charge of the investigation.
And I thought this page was particularly interesting because of the space
Yeah, it's cool.
Aspect of it. And the same thing happened, Jerry did that with Federal Men, because, which also was created by my grandfather, and started out as like the typical sort of pulp adventure story with the feds and the bad guys, and Jerry took it into space, which I thought was really cool. So pretty interesting. Now we're going to go over to our other character, Miss Fury.
Okay, this is another female action character who predates Wonder Woman. Of course, one of the things of extreme interest is that she was created by a woman, June Tarpe Mills, who originally just removed the June and called herself Tarpe Mills when she was still doing 4 or 5 page action strips in the anthology books in 1939, and was quoted at the time as saying she used a male name because she didn't want the boy readers. She felt they'd be disappointed if they found out that these super action men were written by a woman. But by the time she was doing Miss Fury, everyone knew, because her strip was successful enough that they wrote newspaper articles about her. And there's one called Meet Miss Fury. It's all done by mirrors. I think I'm paraphrasing. But that is because Tarpe Mills drew Miss Fury to look like her. By the way, everyone always shows these covers, and these are the timely reprints. And I find it actually very frustrating because that's not Tarpe Mills's art. For the reprints, I believe those covers were drawn actually by Jack Kirby.
Oh,
Early
really?
Kirby, yeah. You don't have any interior pages that you can show. Oh, please show an interior one so you can see her art. Ooh, there she is. There she is, and she looked just like her character. It's all done by mirrors, like the newspaper article said. And there's her cat, a white Persian cat named Perry Purr. And in case you thought it was just a coincidence that she looked just like her character, Miss Fury, the character, has a white Persian cat named Perry Purr. Okay, there's her art, and that's my book. I edited 2 books, 2 collections of Miss Fury, which I don't know if they're even still in print. But if you can find them, they're wonderful. I mean, really, she was very influenced by film noir, which was very big in those days. And another thing, it was very sexy, obviously, but this picture here was not in the comics. During the war, she drew pinups for the military, and when they would send her fan letters, she would send them prints like this, pinup prints of Miss Fury, and autographed for them.
There were guys who had
Nose cones.
Yeah.
Yes, they were nose cones. This is how popular she was, that during the war, there were Miss Fury nose cones on planes.
So here's an interior page.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Another thing, and I see this as signs. It's almost like code that you know this was done by a woman, because the clothes are fabulous. They're very fashionable, and she pays great detail to what is being worn by her heroine and the other women. Whereas in the male strips, I noticed that with Sally, what's her last name? Sally? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, whatever. She's mostly wearing a kind of generic jacket and skirt. Whereas Tarpe Mills pays a lot of attention to the fashion. And you'll see this a lot in the Golden Age comics, that the women who are drawing them pay a lot of attention to the clothes that are being worn, and that the men tended to put the women, who usually were not heroines, usually were just the girlfriend, who was there so she could be rescued, they tended to put them in simple knee-length red dresses, maybe a little bit low-cut, because they just weren't looking at what women were wearing. Yes, oh yeah, I mean, she's an action heroine, and she's defending herself against a bad guy right there. And not only was she an action heroine, but her cat, Perry Purr, was often an action cat. There's times when he leaps up and claws the face of a guy who's about to shoot Marla. Marla Drake is, of course, the alter ego of Miss Fury.
Would you tell that story a little bit about how she became Miss Fury?
Oh yeah, it's a great story. She's a socialite. She's very young, by the way. In the strip, she actually turns 21, so she's really young. So it starts out, she's not even 21 yet, and she's going to a costume party and discovers that someone else is wearing the exact same costume. So she rips it off and says, now what'll I do? And her maid, she has a French maid who later features in the story because she's a refugee and there's a lot going on with the war and with Nazis. But her French maid says, oh la la, Miss Mademoiselle Marla, what about the leopard skin, the panther skin that your uncle, the famous explorer, brought back from Africa? So she brings her this panther skin, and apparently it has a curse on it. So whoever wears it, is going to be cursed. So of course she puts it on. And it fits her also. I don't suppose you have any pictures of Miss Fury in her pants. Well, why don't you go back to the one where she's putting on the panther skin? That one, yeah. You can see that this panther skin fits her perfectly. And if there's a curse, the curse consists of her immediately starting to have adventures, because as she is driving on the way to the costume party in her panther skin, she's intercepted by a guy who has just escaped from prison, and the story goes on from there.
So, I guess it's his great
Bill Finn is the great nephew of Tarpe Mills, and his father was Barry Finn, whom Tarpe Mills immortalized. She had a strip in 1939, pre-Miss Fury, called Daredevil Barry Finn. And that's a real guy. That was her nephew.
Mm-hmm. And these are cutout. These are paper dolls. So you can't see them very well. I'm sorry. They're paper dolls. That didn't she send them to people?
No, I don't think she sent the paper dolls to people. She sent the pinups.
But these were featured at that time as the paper dolls with the clothes.
And this is another sign. This is more code that the strip is either drawn by a woman or is meant for a female audience, because little boys are not really known to cut out and dress dolls.
We have Alex has put together something really fun that'll take just a minute, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, do you guys have anything else you want to say before we move on here? Okay. So, all right, Alex.
Okay.
You say you have information of the Gavonian fortifications?
Yes, for sale.
It is difficult to make a price when I do not know how valuable your information may be.
Look at these plans and decide for yourself.
Very interesting, but we are already in possession of this information.
In that case, I'm sorry to have taken your time.
Your intentions were good, and you shall be paid. Perhaps your next information will be better.
Thank you. I shall try to earn the money.
So, my pretty traitor, I find you alone.
Traitor? What do you mean?
I followed you from the Baker's office. You were selling Gavonian plants.
But what is that to you?
I am a Gavonian spy, and now I shall have the pleasure of eliminating a traitor.
You're making a mistake. Princess Yonda of Gavonia is my friend. Now, as you see, the tables are turned.
I should have shot you at once.
If you had done so, you would have killed a friend.
A friend? You?
Yes, I, too, am a Gavonian spy. I am trying to work my way into Vekor's confidence. I knew the information I gave was already in his possession.
Madame, forgive me.
Thank heaven you are safe, Madame Montel. We feared this spy would do you harm.
Fortunately, I was able to defend myself.
You are under arrest, Lawrence. Come.
Say nothing and trust in me. I will save you.
Yes, guess who was Saundra? I couldn't resist. I told Alex I had to do it. So that is our presentation. There's so much more we could all say, but I wanted to give you all a chance to ask any questions if you had any.